Welcome to the Dynamics Mechanics Podcast, Episode 5, Introduction to Enterprise Architecture Patterns. Thank you for joining me on the Dynamics Mechanics Podcast. I'm your host, Stephan Smith, the Dynamics Mechanic. This is the Dynamics 365 Strategy Podcast, where we discuss implementing software systems using the Microsoft Business Applications Platform. It's where I give you the strategies and teach you the techniques I learned in my experience as a delivery architect at Microsoft.
This episode is brought to you by KingswaySoft. KingswaySoft is a leading integration solution provider offering software solutions that make data integrations affordable and painlessly easy. Thousands of enterprise clients from over 80 countries and regions rely on KingswaySoft to integrate data with various business systems in order to drive their business efficiency and fully leverage their information assets. And KingswaySoft now fully works with CDS and Power Apps.
In this episode, I want to talk about something that is kind of near and dear to my heart. I talk about it basically with every customer that I come in contact with, whether it's like a greenfield or even a brownfield project. And it's basically how to build systems with an enterprise-style architecture. Now, the thing about enterprise or about architecture in general is you have to realize that architecture patterns are really a style, right? You don't have one right answer to any particular problem, and each person or each architect is going to have a particular affinity of how they do things. And this is just my style. It's not that it's the right way for every situation, and I'm not trying to allude that it is. But I want you to at least kind of understand some of the concepts that I've learned over the years and how they apply to a Dynamics implementation and the benefits that you might be able to derive by using this kind of style as opposed to some of the other ones. One of the things that I've noticed over time is the way dynamic systems are being built. Traditionally, it's like, I think this is a pattern that comes about where you have a lot of .NET developers becoming Dynamics developers. And when we do that, and the same thing kind of happened to me, is we come in with this kind of .NET mindset and we build things in a certain way without fully understanding the full capabilities of the platform. And what ends up happening is you'll see a lot of times in a lot of systems, especially ones that are having problems, is they are built using a monolithic style architecture where you kind of have this all-in-one Swiss Army knife thing. And what happens is developers will ultimately build things into Dynamics that probably shouldn't be there. And but the thing is, it's easier to build a system in that way, and it's faster. So a lot of times, depending on the customer environment, developers will often be under pressure or, to get things done or build more features. And building using a monolithic architecture, definitely it gets you to a place where if you were to, for example, design a little more complex and sophisticated architecture, it might take you a little bit extra effort and a longer period of time, even though the benefits of that may be something that the customer would appreciate more down the road. It's not as visible. Therefore, there's kind of more of a pressure to go the easy route. But this monolithic architecture style, in my opinion, is one of the primary causes of A, system performance issues, but also B, systems that are just brittle, they're not robust, and they're very hard to maintain. I don't know if you've seen a few projects go live and kind of come back a little while later after the consultants are gone. You often find that customers and their development teams can have a little bit of a challenge when it comes to maintaining a system, but also building on additional functionality to that system after the consulting team has left, or whoever came in. Sometimes companies will hire like a solo developer and he'll come in and do some things. I had one project in particular where I thought it was kind of funny. They had hired a guy, and this is an enterprise customer. They hired a guy who I think maybe he used to work there or something, but he came in and he built a system using 100% JavaScript, like all the business rules, all the business logic. And it was like reams and reams and reams of JavaScript code. And clearly the guy, I don't know if he was a web developer or he just didn't know how to write plugins or bothered to figure out how to write plugins, but he wrote an entire system with JavaScript. And, when you're looking at a 500 page, lines of JavaScript and trying to debug issues, that's not easy to do. The other thing is you'll see in this kind of monolithic style, other kind of patterns start to show up. For example, I'm dealing with a customer right now, and they have a system where the developers decided to build an integration system into Dynamics. Like it runs it basically is the scheduler. It runs the jobs. It actually performs ETL work, and users are importing XML files into Dynamics and running jobs themselves as part of an integration framework. And, not surprisingly, this system also happens to have performance issues. And this isn't the only instance I've seen things like this. I've seen systems where, for example, I was on a project once and they decided to build like this accounting system into Dynamics. And while the accounting aspect kind of made sense from the functionality that was needed by the system, it kind of didn't make sense to have a bunch of very expensive consultants building an accounting system. And, one day I just said, there's this thing called QuickBooks. It does accounting pretty well too. Not to say that was the answer to the problem. I just felt like there's too many things that we do in Dynamics because we can make Dynamics do pretty much anything. And that's a big problem. And it's a temptation that any good tech lead would try to, avoid at all. Sometimes a customer is going to try to push a certain style of functionality into a system where it may not really fit. Maybe that functionality should be somewhere else. And that kind of gets us into what we're talking about today. So in this kind of monolithic architecture, as I mentioned, there's a lot of things that happen in Dynamics that really shouldn't. It's kind of like that whole saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Well, what happens, that's a US kind of slang for this place, Las Vegas. If you guys know Las Vegas, then look it up if you don't know about it. But anyway, so this monolithic style architecture is a problem because it makes things very challenging. It also leads to some other bad practices, like things that .NET developers do in an on-prem installation that make it not cloud compatible. And I'm working on a project where that's the case as well. So you have to kind of look at the monolith, and in order to kind of get it into the right direction, you have to start breaking it down. And this is kind of how I break down systems so that I can move it into what I describe as an enterprise architecture. And it kind of goes as follows. So in my view of how systems should be built, I break down systems into basically 4 core functionalities. And the way I break these down, it's in an effort to encapsulate functional requirements in such a way that it A, makes the system more maintainable, B, it makes it can make it more robust, but C, it also captures the essence of the system in a way to where we have these smaller components that are easier to manage than this one huge blob of a thing that we now have to try to figure out and hope if we poke it in one direction, it doesn't break 5 other things. So those functional areas that I like to break things down into are the core, which is like the core operations of the dynamic system. There's ancillary functionality, integrations, and reporting. I can pretty much fit everything that I need that should be in the context of a system into one of these 4 buckets. And as we go along, like I said, in one of the projects I'm dealing with right now, we have this monolithic system that has all kinds of problems. And what we're doing is a cloud migration. This system is on-prem and it's hard locked on-prem because there's a lot of nasty stuff. For example, direct database access. There's other things like tightly coupled RPC or web service calls coming straight out of Dynamics into a web service that's on-prem. And these things need to be refactored so that we can get this system ready, or at least be compatible with going online. I don't want to encourage the customer to think that it would be a good idea once we get it to this kind of like minimal place where we can elevate this thing to the cloud, that's a good idea. There's certainly a lot of other things or the work that needs to be done to really make sure that going to the cloud doesn't end up causing other issues, because there's certainly other things that have to be addressed if it's going to be a nice experience. And I always want all my customers to have a nice experience. And so I have to tell them, hey, we're going to get you to that cloud compatibility place first, but I would hope you don't just chuck it up to the cloud and think it's going to be flowers and sunshine. So when we break down these things into their functional kind of areas, it certainly makes things a lot easier. So for example, with the core area, the way I like to design dynamic systems is from a performance standpoint. Performance is always something that is always on my mind, because you have to design for performance up front. If you wait until you deploy a system and then think about performance, it's kind of already too late. You've already jumped off the plane, so to speak, and now you're hoping that your parachute can open while you're falling to the ground. And when you have a performance event, it's just not a fun thing to do. I've seen a few events that I've had to live through, and let's just say after a couple times back in the day, I went through that. I definitely did not want to go through that again. So that's kind of how I ended up into this space, is basically trying to save my own keister. But it ended up being something that I ended up seeing a lot of the patterns that were going on, and I just kind of collected those over the years. But the core functionality of a system is like what Dynamics does for the users. And the way I look at Dynamics is the thing that is focused on the user. It really shouldn't be doing other things. And like, for example, like if I can make sure that a lot of the async jobs and all that are focused on user activity and user experience, then I can push everything else outside of Dynamics. And that certainly helps when it comes to performance, but it makes the system a lot more maintainable. And the way we do this is with microservices. And if you've not heard of microservices, I mean, it's been around for a while. Look it up if you haven't heard of it. But a microservice is just basically a piece of functionality that is abstracted and encapsulated in its own environment, such that it is scalable on its own and it's maintainable in a separate code base. And I really love this architecture because it helps keep things more simple. It's easier when you see something go wrong to say, oh yeah, hey, that's that, duplicate detection service. We need to go change the rules on that. It's not like, oh, let's break open this 5,000 line piece of, plugin code and figure out where it is. You just go to that service and you figure out, okay, here's what we change or whatever. And the reason microservices is definitely a great thing for Dynamics is Azure. I mean, if you're doing a cloud, deployment, it's pretty easy to create things as microservices because you can create almost pretty much whatever you want as long as IT lets you. But like, you can even do this on-prem. So for example, in a project that I'm working on right now, there's this tightly coupled integration where there's these workflows calling a web service, and that just doesn't work going to online because the moment you push Dynamics up to the cloud, they're trying to synchronously call these web services, and that's a problem when it comes to firewalls and security and all this stuff. And just for the fact that it's just not a good idea to have Dynamics calling some on-prem asset in a plugin or a workflow, just because if it needs to succeed, there's a lot of points of failure that can happen. And not to mention having to work with the security team. I've never had a great experience working with the security team at any customer. They're pretty, serious when it comes to security, and they don't like opening up firewall ports. And then, once you get past that, then you got like application servers and databases and all this stuff can fail, right? And I just don't like that style of architecture. So basically the first thing here in this case is to decouple or encapsulate the custom workflows that are calling web services into their own service. And basically how I'm doing this, at least initially, is I'm taking those workflow assemblies and I'm moving them out of Dynamics, and I'm actually going to use messaging between the front and back end servers and the application servers. And by doing that, I'm decoupling the call because, they're actually async calls, but I'm decoupling the web service call from Dynamics such that when this system does move to the cloud, we're going to switch it over and use Azure Service Bus. And those messages will still be consumed on-prem, but we don't have to open up any firewalls. We don't have to worry about all the other points of failure when we introduce durable messaging. We have a retry mechanism if a message fails or due to a transient error or something like that. We can just pull that message again. Another worker can pull that down and retry. But the other aspects of this enterprise architecture methodology is, for example, the ancillary functionality. And what I describe as ancillary functionality is anything that Dynamics needs to do that is extra, right? It's not it's necessary, but it's extra. And what I mean by extra is, for example, when you're dealing with like a sales system, right? There's typically functionality for do not call lists or email opt-outs or, duplicate detection. These are things that are necessary pieces of functionality, but they're ancillary. So things like this, we can actually orchestrate outside of Dynamics as a microservice. So duplicate detection, for example, one of the things that I prefer, especially in an enterprise scenario where you may have some integrations, you may have an outside party that is feeding leads, let's say, for example, into your system. I would much rather have those leads come into, let's say, a queue where I can then process them and use a staging database or do whatever it is I need to do before those leads actually go to Dynamics, right? As opposed to, for example, what traditionally happens is all the leads just go flying straight into Dynamics. Now, you do have situations where, for example, a user is going to import an Excel spreadsheet of leads, right? So you still have to accommodate the scenario where the user is importing the leads, but you may have another vendor with leads coming in. What you need, or what you can do, is create a microservice for duplicate detection. And that can have its own, web service. It could have its own database. In fact, that's what I recommend. And it's in charge of duplicate detection. Even records that are entered into the system manually, it can check all those, and it can be the engine unto itself. And if you use something like, for example, function apps or whatever, they're scalable, right? They're scalable on their own. And I like that because each piece that we build is its own scalable part of the architecture. And so, for example, the next thing is integrations, right? Integrations is always a really big thing. In fact, every project that I've been on that has had a lot of challenges, it oftentimes, for technical challenges, it usually comes down to integrations. Integrations is one of those things where, as the more integrations are required for a particular project, the harder it is to be successful. I had one particular project where we had over 100 separate integrations. And let me tell you, that was an absolute nightmare, because dealing with that many integrations, and each integration had its own kind of thing, right? It's like we were talking to different vendors, and they all had their own formats and protocols and ways. Like sometimes we had to use FTP, and sometimes it was a web service call, and then all these different things. And integrations is just one of those things that needs to be encapsulated into its own architecture. In fact, I have what I like to call an integration framework, or a style that I use when it comes to integrations. And basically, it kind of boils down to messaging for near real-time processing, and SSIS for basically data set operations, where it doesn't make sense to use a messaging engine to send 1 million rows of data up to SQL Azure. For example, like that kind of stuff. SSIS is great for that, and that's what it's for. Also, when it comes to the cloud, we can use Azure Data Factory, and we can lift and shift SSIS packages and run them up there in our data center, which I think is a great thing, especially when we're deciding whether what data lives on-prem and what data lives in the cloud. And that gets into a whole nother set of things that we kind of have to deal with, but probably too much information for this particular episode. The other thing is reporting, right? In my last episode, if you listen to that, I talked about the multi-geo deployment strategy, where if you are dealing with a customer that has basically a distributed user base across the planet, one of the strategies that you can use is to partition your system into different segments that you can then run more locally to those particular user segments, such that they're not being hit with the internet latency challenges that come with querying a system from the other side of the planet. One of the things that is challenging, or more challenging, when it comes to partitioning your system is reporting, because now you have different copies of your data in different parts of the world. But obviously, corporate is going to want to report on that data holistically, as opposed to separately. So what you can do is you can replicate data to a centralized database, say, in whatever region that the headquarters or whoever wants to see the data is. And you can aggregate that data into, say, for example, a SQL Azure database, and then feed it to Power BI. And then that way you can still kind of render the holistic picture of what's going on globally, while still meeting the needs of the people that are in the different regions. But the 4 categories, again, are the core, ancillary functionality, integrations, and reporting. I look at systems when I design them in these 4 categories, and this is really the start of how I approach building the plugins, the integration framework, and all the features that go along with a particular system. And like I said, when you get to functionality that, as of today, you may think, oh yeah, we'll just build that in CRM. I want you to think about, does this really make sense? Does this directly serve the user? Or is it functionality that supports business operations of a user? So for example, we mentioned the duplicate detection. You may do other things like, for example, a do not call list or things like that where you're maintaining whether you can call people. Like those kind of things, they speak microservice to me when I hear them. And I always try to go in that direction. Now you might say, oh, well, if I'm on-prem, how do I do that? Well, one technique that you can use is use whatever messaging platform technology that your particular customer subscribes to. Sometimes you can use Microsoft Message Queue. You might deal with RabbitMQ. You might deal with IBM Message Queue. There's several out there for on-prem that you can use depending on what your customer wants. But then what I like to do is create basically a Windows services, right? So these microservices run with a Windows service, and maybe they have a SQL backend. And if they're using messaging, for example, let's say a new lead is created in the system, a message is sent out that says to the service basically, hey, a new lead was created. So what I can do there is I can say, oh, okay, do I need to detect if this is a duplicate? And also I can check if it's on the do not call list. And so, but these services are acting independently of each other, and their code base is maintained separately such that we're not dealing with this monolithic thing that is harder to maintain and is less robust. So anyway, those are just some ideas, and this is just the beginning of this topic. This is by no means the end all of this topic. This is just a kind of a primer, and we'll talk a little bit deeper into this subject in future episodes. Hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Dynamics Mechanics Podcast. Feel free to reach out and connect with me on social media. You can find me on Twitter at Stephan Smith CRM, and that's STEPHAN. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Stephan Smith CRM as well. And feel free to check out my website, and that's dynamicsmechanics.com. Thank you.